we'll be taking up the third chapter today. I'll be taking up the third chapter. I think you have a second class as well. Haji hai na second class? Sunil sir ki. Okay. Yeah. So he'll be taking the next three chapters. I think he'll also take 2 days, today and tomorrow. Chalo. This third chapter is with respect to government's finances. The focus of this chapter in economic survey is to talk about 1, the state of government finances, and 2nd, the sustainability of government's finances. That is basically sustainability of debt. Questions from this particular chapter quite frequent in prelims and mains regarding trends of taxes, trends of expenses, which tax is more, which expenditure is more, which deficit is more. इस टाइप से ट्रेंड वाले सवाल काफी कॉमन है प्रीलिम्स में. In mains, questions from this chapter can be asked in paper 2 and paper 3. In paper 2 you have got analysis of various schemes, so therein you can incorporate analysis of government expenses, and obviously in paper 3 जहाँ पे आपको sustainability of debt वाला part है. So this chapter, as in government finances, a little bit boring, as in there are many statistics here, many facts here, but we don't have to focus on those numbers. More than that, we have to focus on the trends of those numbers. वो important है, तो हम trends के ऊपर ज़्यादा focus करते हैं. All right. When we talk about government's finances, basically we talk about government's revenue account and capital account. Revenue account has revenue receipts, revenue expenses. Capital account, capital receipts, capital expenses. What goes in revenue, what goes in capital? Capital is anything that affects assets and liabilities. Whenever there is some effect on assets and liabilities of government, that will be included in capital account. Whenever it doesn't affect assets or liabilities, it goes into revenue account. So this is the logic that we are going to use. Effect on assets, liabilities, capital account, otherwise goes to revenue account. How do we define revenue? Revenue is the core functions of the government, the sovereign aspects of the government. That is what revenue is. Government collects money because it is government as a matter of right, where government ki revenue receipts. Government spends money because it is government, as in it is supposed to incur some expenses because it is government. That is revenue expenses. So core aspects जो है वो revenue account के अंदर आते हैं, assets liability वाले aspects वो capital account के अंदर आते हैं. Revenue receipts classified into two types, tax revenue and non-tax revenue. Tax revenue के अंदर we have direct taxes, indirect taxes. Non-tax revenue के अंदर we have got interest received by the government, fines and fees collected by the government, dividend received from PSUs, any kind of grants that the government receives. ये सब क्या है? Government की revenue receipts है. Revenue expenses में क्या आता है सरकार की? Mostly it is salaries and pensions, payment of interest on the borrowings taken earlier, transfers to states which are not loans, subsidy expenses, maintenance expenses. ये सब सरकार के revenue expenses में आते हैं. Capital receipts में क्या आता है? You have got two types of capital receipts which create debt, that is government के loans, and non-debt capital receipts. Basically when government sells some PSU, disinvestment receipt, या फिर when the government had lent some money in past, government receives that money back, repayment of loans that the government had advanced. वो भी सरकार की capital receipts का part है. So these are government's capital receipts, debt capital and non-debt capital. Then what are capital expenses? Anything that leads to creation of assets or reduction of liabilities is capital expenses. Government creates a road, government builds a port, government creates a new company, government is creating some assets. These are all asset creation expenses, capital expenses. Government repays a loan which it had taken in past. When you repay the loan, it becomes again an expenditure which reduces your liability, hence part of capital expenses. So ये हमारे capital expenses, capital receipts, and before that revenue expenses and revenue receipts. These are broadly how we organize government's finances into. Let's see what has been the state of these finances. With respect to what happened during the past few years, we have been facing this conundrum of government's policy actions. We discussed the shocks yesterday. Economy witnessed a lot of shocks, falling growth, as a result of that expansionary policies, as a result of that inflation. And now you have to curb inflation. The question that the governments across the world have been facing, and Indian government is no different from them, the question that they have been facing is how to withdraw this fiscal stimulus that we have given. Government gave some fiscal stimulus, as in government increased its expenses. जो सरकार के expenses है, revenue expense, capital expense, government has increased all these expenses. Certainly incurring capital expense is desirable, incurring more revenue expense is not desirable. But it is necessary, not now, as in it was necessary during the past few years. Due to falling growth, more dependency upon the people on government's welfare expenses. तो ये वाले expenses हमारे काफी बढ़ गए थे. Because of these revenue expenses increasing, we witnessed high inflation along with expansionary monetary policy that was a cause of high inflation. Now we have to cut down on these expenses. If we cut down on these expenses, surely we are going to compromise upon growth. Surely it is going to lead to dependency upon the vulnerable sections, it is going to lead to vulnerability of vulnerable sections who were dependent upon the government due to this pandemic-induced issues. The question therefore that the government faces is कि how soon can we withdraw these expenses? अगर withdraw नहीं करते हैं तो it is going to continue to lead to inflation. अगर withdraw करते हैं, it is going to lead to compromise upon growth. So we have to calibrate, we have to think carefully that how do we withdraw? Too fast withdrawal may lead to what we call as quote unquote hard landing. I'm sure सबने सुना होगा word hard landing. अखबार में काफी frequently आ रहा है hard landing. Hard landing क्या है? Hard landing is that you cut down on money supply immediately. As a result of that, growth falls immediately. That is hard landing. So the question that policymakers are facing is that how soon can you cut down on all this stimulus that has been given in past? You cut it down fast, results in hard landing, that is fast slowdown, fast compromise on growth. If you don't cut it down or cut it down slowly, it is going to continue to feed into inflation. Hence, that is a conundrum that we, along with the rest of the world, has been facing. It is in respect of this conundrum that this chapter tries to address that what can be the strategy of improving our our financial state, our financial position. Meaning government's expenses should come down, government's receipts should go up. How can we ensure that its expenses come down, its receipts go up? To improve receipts, you have to increase taxes. Increasing taxes will put additional burden upon taxpayers. To cut down expenses, that is going to lead to vulnerable people feeling left out because government is spending less on subsidies. How do you try to balance these things? That you can cut down on expenses, you can increase taxes so that your financial position improves. This is what this chapter is dealing with. Basically, improvement of government's finances. पहले कुछ देख लेने क्या क्या है गवर्नमेंट फाइनेंसेस के ऊपर. सबसे पहले फिस्कल डेफिसिट. Our fiscal deficit increased to around 9.2% during the pandemic year, FY21, when government had to borrow drastically. Our FRBM Act mandates that our fiscal deficit should be within 3% of GDP. Post NK Singh committee, which gave recommendations how to reform FRBM Act. After that, we were on the path of reducing and consolidating fiscal position. Our fiscal deficit had declined and we were right on track of achieving our desirable fiscal deficit. However, due to pandemic, our fiscal deficit drastically shot up and now our task is to bring it down. We are bringing it down. It was 9.2% in the pandemic year. Next year 6.7, next year 6.4. This year, as in FY24, it is budgeted to 5.9%. So our fiscal deficit has been coming down. So we are fine on this front. Obviously, a fiscal deficit of 5.9% this year or 6.4% last year is well beyond our FRBM target. However, we have to see it in context. It is high because this is quite high. You borrowed a lot during this particular year. You borrowed a lot during this particular year. Hence, you spent a lot. It is not as if that next year you stop borrowing and spending altogether. You will have to gradually withdraw the stimulus that was given. You borrowed and spent because number one, your own resources were less. Number two, there was a greater requirement to spend. Your own resources are not going to increase to the pre-pandemic level immediately next year. They are going to take some time to reach that particular level. One. Second, you have incurred expenditure commitments here. You are not going to, you cannot withdraw all those expenditure commitments immediately next year. So your denominator, that is your revenues, are going to slowly increase and your expenses are going to slowly decrease. Therefore, there is a slow path. There is a gradual path towards fiscal consolidation. There is no quick path. ऐसा नहीं कि आप 9.2 से दोबारा से अगले साल 4.7 पे आ जाओगे, अगले साल 3.4 के ऊपर आ जाओगे. You have to take a slow path. We are taking that gradual path as in a sustainable path where our fiscal deficit is declining in a sustained manner. Declining in a manner that it doesn't lead to immediate withdrawal of fiscal stimulus. It doesn't lead to immediate imposition of higher taxes upon people. That is what we see here, a gradual decline of fiscal deficit. One reason that our fiscal deficit has been coming down, one reason that our revenues have been steadily rising, more importantly, reason that we have been meeting the targets that we have set. Our fiscal deficit was 9.2% in FY21, obviously quite high. And in this year, we came up with a fiscal consolidation roadmap. कि हम किस तरीके से step by step अपना fiscal deficit कम करेंगे. So this year we plan to reach to 5.9%. 5.9% was planned year before only. कि हम plan कर रहे थे कि इस साल हमारा target 5.9 होना चाहिए. Last year का हमारा target 6.4 था और हम लगभग last year के target के आसपास ही हैं. इस साल का target 5.9 है. Probably we are going to meet this year's target also. This is fiscal consolidation roadmap. Why is it that we are able to meet our targets? We also used to set our targets earlier, but this time we are able to meet our targets as well. I will repeat this thing. High fiscal deficit. FRBM Act mandates you bring it down to 3%. FRBM Act mandates that you present fiscal consolidation roadmap, that how are you going to achieve this targeted level. So from 9, you have to tell the government, you have to tell the parliament that how are we going to achieve to this 3% level of fiscal deficit. That is your fiscal consolidation roadmap. Fiscal consolidation roadmap is supposed to be presented with budget every year under the FRBM Act. Earlier, we also used to present this fiscal consolidation roadmap, that is these targets. However, earlier we were not able to meet these targets. Now we are reasonably close to meeting these targets that we set. One important reason that we are able to meet these targets, the targets that we announce early and then later on we try to meet them reasonably close to what we announced, is because of certain budgetary reforms that we have undertaken. An important budgetary reform undertaken is to bring under the line items to above the line items. What are these below the line items and above the line items? Below the line का मतलब क्या है? छुपा हुआ. Above the line मतलब जो दिख रहा है. What is visible versus what is invisible. Earlier, when I used to present the budget, in the budget, I would say that this year I am going to borrow 3% of GDP. My fiscal deficit is going to be 3%. That was above the line. Below the line मतलब क्या हुआ? Apart from that, I would say that I would also borrow 2% of GDP, but that is not part of the budget. मतलब मैं बजट के अंदर उस 2% एक्स्ट्रा को लिख ही नहीं रहा हूं. Through some accountancy, through some legal means, what I would say that this borrowing is exempted from FRBM target. सरकार ने बोरो तो किया है, लेकिन सरकार उसको अपने FRBM टारगेट में इंक्लूड करने से एग्जेम्प्ट कर रही है. फैक्ट क्या है? गवर्नमेंट ने बोरो किया है. इजी कॉन्सेप्ट है, बहुत आसानी से समझ में आ जाएगा. As a finance minister, I have to present the budget. In the budget, I will tell that how much are my expenses, how much are my receipts, and therefore how much am I going to borrow in a particular year. I say this year I will borrow 100 rupees. 100 rupees becomes my fiscal deficit. Then what I'll do is during the year, I will present some more expenses, and for them I will need to find out resources. The resources which I need to find out for these extra expenses, I will call them as that these are extra budgetary resources. I will not include them in my budget. सरकार स्पेंड तो कर रही है, लेकिन सरकार बजट के बाहर स्पेंड कर रही है. बजट के बाहर रख के बोरो कर रही है, बजट के बाहर स्पेंड कर रही है. For example, government wants to give subsidy so that people do not bear the brunt of high crude oil prices. Government says that petroleum for people will be cheap, as in petrol and diesel would be cheap. People should not bear these high prices of crude. People should not bear the burden because of high price of crude oil. Now, Indian Oil is an oil marketing company. Indian Oil can obviously not sell oil at a loss. If government asks that you sell oil at a lesser price, somebody would have to ultimately bear the loss. तो वो loss कौन bear करेगा? Indian Oil बोलेगा कि भाई there is a loss. Cost of me selling petrol is 105 rupees and you are asking me to sell it at 95 rupees. Hence, I need compensation for these 10 rupees. 10 रुपए मुझे आपको देने पड़ेंगे. अब ये 10 रुपए सरकार इंडियन ऑयल को कहां से देगी? सरकार इंडियन ऑयल को बोलेगी कि आप मार्केट से जाके बोरो कर लो 10 रुपए. Indian Oil will say that why would anybody lend to me? It is a loss making proposition. If you are the lender, I am the borrower. आप मेरे से पूछोगे ना क्यों पैसा ले रहे हो? Because you would want to secure that the money that you are lending to me comes back to you. Why would you lend to a money to some person who discloses it to you that this money is for loss making proposition? Obviously nobody is going to lend for that purpose. So Indian Oil would say to the government that nobody will lend to us if we declare that we are going to incur 10 rupees loss on the oil that we sell. Then government will come in and say that okay, we will give a guarantee for your borrowing. We give a guarantee that if you borrow this money, then we are going to repay this money. That means actually government is going to repay this money. It is a government company. Government has given the guarantee and government says that we will repay this money on your behalf. This money is technically borrowed by Indian Oil, but practically it is borrowed by the government. तो ये मनी जो है सरकार के फिस्कल डेफिसिट में नहीं दिखेगा. सरकार के फिस्कल डेफिसिट में कौन सा मनी दिखेगा? जो सरकार ने खुद के लिए बोरो किया है. This money was not borrowed by the government for itself. It was borrowed by the government for Indian Oil. Hence, this money becomes below the line money, borrowing of the government. This is kind of fraudulent practice. I'm sure everybody can understand that you are trying to reduce the total borrowing that you disclose to the market by putting off your borrowings for yourself versus your entities. Your entities, as in your distribution companies or your oil marketing companies, whatever money is given to them via your borrowing, you are putting those things off from your official borrowing. Your actual borrowing is quite high, whereas your shown borrowing is less. ये जो accounting practice थी, this is kind of a fraud on the people of the country. Budget is supposed to be a document budget is supposed to be a document to extract financial accountability from the government. But if government take recourse to such practices, it reduces the sanctity of the budget document. So government has reformed this practice and government has stopped all these extra budgetary borrowings. From around 1.2 lakh crore rupees of extra budgetary borrowing, that is outside budget borrowing, Last year, the extra budgetary borrowings came down to around 750 crore rupees, and this year they are exactly zero. This year there is no extra budgetary borrowing. So therefore, this shows that government is bringing these below the line items to above the line items. As a result of that, the estimates of borrowing are more realistic, the estimates of spending are more realistic, and therefore your probability to meet your targets is better. सबको समझ में आया है? Why are we able to meet the targets? This is the main question. Why are we able to meet the targets? और what एक जनरल सवाल पूछा सकता है that what are the budgetary reforms? Budgetary reforms जैसे in 2017 we took certain reforms. Abolition of plan, non-plan expenditure. I'm not going to explain those parts. Abolition of plan, non-plan expenditure, merger of railway budget with general budget, and preponement of budget presentation date from 28 February to 1st February. Now, these reforms are there in economic survey. You can refer to economic survey for that. Plus, there is a fourth reform also regarding these above the line and below the line expenses, meaning more realistic expectations in the budget. You are not hiding anything in the budget. Budget is now prepared in a more transparent and in a more realistic manner. Because the budget preparation is done in such a manner, therefore your ability to meet expenses is, your ability to meet targets is quite high. This is one important aspect of budgetary reforms. Okay? Falling fiscal deficit in line with our fiscal consolidation roadmap, that is fiscal consolidation path. And more importantly, we are almost close to achieving what we set out the target for ourselves earlier. Okay? Regarding government's receipts, तो पहले नॉन डेट receipt के अंदर क्या जाती है? सरकार की टैक्स रिसीट्स, नॉन टैक्स रिसीट्स एंड नॉन डेट कैपिटल रिसीट्स. यहाँ पे क्या लिखा है? नॉन डेट रिसीट्स. अगेन प्रीलिम्स का सवाल है, विच ऑफ द फॉलोइंग आर गवर्नमेंट्स नॉन डेट रिसीट्स. नॉन डेट रिसीट मतलब क्या है? सरकार की दो रिसीट्स हैं, कैपिटल रिसीट्स, रेवेन्यू रिसीट्स. रेवेन्यू रिसीट्स के अंदर टैक्स रिसीट्स एंड नॉन टैक्स रिसीट्स, कैपिटल रिसीट्स के अंदर डेट रिसीट्स एंड नॉन डेट रिसीट्स. देयरफॉर व्हाट आर total non-debt receipts of the government? They are revenue receipts plus non-debt capital receipts. So these are government's total non-debt receipts. When we look at government's non-debt receipts, पहले हम देखते हैं taxes. Tax revenue of the government has been growing. In fact, it has been quite buoyant. अभी buoyancy वाला part हम discuss करेंगे. We have seen sustained revenue buoyancy, meaning our taxes are growing at a faster pace as compared to GDP. क्या होती है tax buoyancy? Tax buoyancy. Yes, percentage growth in taxes upon percentage growth in GDP. Your economy grows by 5%. Your taxes grow by 6%. Hence, you say that taxes are buoyant. Why? Because taxes are growing at a pace faster than growth in GDP. GDP is growing at a slower pace. Tax collection of the government grows at a faster pace. ये होती है tax buoyancy. We are observing high tax buoyancy. When we calculate tax buoyancy, तब हम GDP growth लेते हैं, nominal GDP growth, क्योंकि taxes का growth भी nominal ही हम ले सकते हैं. Last year, government collected a particular amount of tax. Government collected a tax amount of 20 rupees. This year, it collects 22 rupees. तो tax amount collected. टैक्स अमाउंट लास्ट ईयर था 20 रुपए, जो कि अब की बार बढ़ के हो गया 22 रुपए, वर्सेस वैल्यू ऑफ नॉमिनल जीडीपी. नॉमिनल जीडीपी विच वाज, नॉमिनल मींस वैल्यू ऑफ दिस ईयर्स आउटपुट एट दिस ईयर्स प्राइस. वैल्यू ऑफ लास्ट ईयर्स आउटपुट एट लास्ट ईयर्स प्राइस वाज लेट्स से 100 रुपीज. वैल्यू ऑफ दिस ईयर्स आउटपुट एट दिस ईयर्स प्राइस इज लेट्स से 120 रुपीज. इंक्रीज इन नॉमिनल जीडीपी, इंक्रीज इन टैक्सेस. ये 20% से इंक्रीज हुआ है, ये 10% से इंक्रीज हुआ है. सो वील से दैट टैक्स बायंसी इज लेस देन 1. टैक्सेस ग्रो बाय 10%, जीडीपी ग्रोज बाय 20%, हेंस बायंसी इज 0.5, दैट इज लेस देन 1. Taxes grow slowly as compared to GDP. What we have been observing is that our taxes have become very buoyant. When you look at buoyancy of taxes, buoyancy का सवाल प्रीलिम्स के अंदर पूछा हुआ है 2-3 बार. And buoyancy का सवाल, let me tell you, they did not ask simply that what is tax buoyancy. They have asked really difficult question with respect to tax buoyancy. When you look at tax buoyancy, there are two ways to look at it. One, you can look at it for a particular year only, versus you can look at it over a long period. In 1 year, you may witness high growth of taxes vis-a-vis growth of GDP. That means in 1 year, your taxes may be very buoyant. However, the true picture emerges when you look at the long-term trend. When you look at the long-term trend of taxes, I'll come back to these things. When you look at the long-term trend of taxes versus GDP, our tax buoyancy of indirect taxes in the pre-GST era, listen carefully, indirect taxes in the pre-GST era was around 1. Meaning economy grew at an average of around 11.54% and taxes grew at an average of around 11.53%. तो लगभग 1 के आसपास हमारी tax buoyancy थी. This is pre-GST versus the nominal terms के अंदर economic growth versus post-GST. Our economy has grown by an average around 9.6%, whereas taxes have grown by around 10.9%, meaning our buoyancy is around 1.12, meaning more than 1. Our taxes have been more buoyant. अब देखो ये पोस्ट जीएसटी में तुमको दिख रहा होगा कि इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ 9.6 है, यहाँ पे 11.54 थी, टैक्स ग्रोथ 10.9 है, यहाँ पे 11.53 है. तो आपको दिख रहा होगा कि टैक्स ग्रोथ कम हो गई है, इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ कम हो गई है पहले से. ये कम क्यों होती हुई दिख रही है हमको? बिकॉज दिस इज एवरेज ग्रोथ बिटवीन FY 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. यहाँ पे बीच में एक जगह कॉन्ट्रैक्शन है. Between FY 20, FY 21, there is a contraction here. Our economy contracted by a certain amount. तो हम ये एवरेज कैलकुलेट कर रहे हैं 5 साल का, जिसके अंदर एक ईयर ऐसा भी है जहां पे हमारी ग्रोथ अराउंड -7% के आसपास थी. सो देयरफॉर देयर इज दैट शॉक ईयर एज वेल हियर. Even when you incorporate that shock year, even then we have around 10% economic growth, nominal terms, 9.6% economic growth nominal terms में, and around 10.9% tax growth in nominal terms. So our buoyancy has been quite high. Whenever buoyancy has been high, that means government's taxes will grow at a faster pace as compared to revenue of the as compared to GDP of the country. That is one reason that we have been able to collect more taxes and hence move down this fiscal consolidation path. हमारा fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP क्यों कम हो रहा है? हमारा बहुत ज़्यादा था 9.2%, 9.1% in FY 20 and after that it is reducing. It is supposed to reduce even faster than that. But अगर faster reduce होगा तो then there is going to be compromise upon growth, hard landing जिसको हमने बोला. As in government would spend less. So we would want fiscal deficit to come down. How is fiscal deficit coming down? It is coming down as a percentage of GDP because one, GDP is growing and second, government's taxes are growing at a faster pace than GDP. GDP grows plus taxes grow at a faster pace, meaning taxes are buoyant. If taxes are buoyant, therefore fiscal deficit will come down faster. Exam में जो सवाल पूछा था buoyancy के ऊपर, I'm not going to discuss that question, I'll just simply tell that question to you. Was with respect to buoyancy and inequality in the society. अगर एक सोसाइटी के अंदर टैक्सेस बायंट है तो क्या वो इनइक्वालिटी दर्शाता है? नहीं दर्शाता है. डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन ऑफ इनकम के ऊपर पूछा गया था. सो क्वेश्चंस विद रिस्पेक्ट टू बायंसी आर क्वाइट, द क्वेश्चंस दैट हैव बीन आस्क्ड range from easier to difficult questions. So you must know this concept very clearly. Buoyancy. This time around you should be able to read between the lines here that how does buoyancy affects fiscal deficit. That's quite easy. कि buoyancy क्या है हमारा? Buoyancy is percentage growth of taxes upon percentage growth of GDP. If tax is buoyant, meaning taxes are growing faster, therefore need to borrow would be less. Hence fiscal deficit will decline faster. This is how buoyancy affects fiscal deficit. Clear? चलो वापस से आते हैं उस पे. You'll come back to this thing that why are taxes buoyant. We have been witnessing an increased tax collection because of various efforts taken up by the government. Again, these efforts are important. GST, digital economic transactions, greater formalization of the economy, all these things leading to more tax collection by the government. Simplification of tax administration, for example, faceless tax assessment. Because of this, the interface between the tax assessee and the assessor. Assessee मतलब क्या है? जो person जिसका tax assessment हो रहा है. There is no physical interface. अगर मेरे ऊपर कोई tax का notice आया है, so I don't know which income tax officer has sent that notice to me. It is the system that has sent the notice to me. As a result of that, there is no way that I can bribe anybody out. If I cannot bribe anybody out, that means I will have to pay my tax dues. If I pay my tax dues, obviously government's tax revenues will increase. Otherwise, I would have bribed my way out. As a result of that, government का tax revenue नहीं बढ़ता, भले ही मेरा खर्चा बढ़ जाता. So all these are measures because of which government's taxes have been increasing. Tax administration, simplification of return filing, e-way bills under GST, information sharing between government departments. What is tax elasticity? Percentage increase in tax rate. There are many other factors that affect tax collection. Tax revenue of the government will depend upon multiple factors. Tax rate is one factor, economic growth is another factor, tax administration is one factor, return filing process is another factor, nature of taxes is another factor, information sharing between government departments is another factor. So there are many factors which are going to influence government's tax revenues. टैक्स रेवेन्यू केवल और केवल टैक्स रेट से डिटरमाइन नहीं हो रहे हैं, टैक्स रेवेन्यू केवल और केवल इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ से डिटरमाइन नहीं हो रहे हैं. Tax elasticity is a general concept. Tax buoyancy is a particular case of tax elasticity. Tax elasticity is how elastic are taxes with respect to the factors which affect taxes. How much has been the growth in tax revenue? Just example, percentage growth in tax revenue, percentage growth in taxes upon, for example, change in tax administration. Now, इसको मैथमेटिकली नहीं देखो, आप चेंज इन टैक्स एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन को मैथमेटिकली नहीं लिख सकते हो यहाँ पे, but this is what is representing elasticity, that administration has changed by how much has your tax revenue changed. Tax rates have changed by how much have your tax revenue changed. Tax structure has changed from pre-GST to post-GST. Tax structure has changed by how much has your tax revenue changed. तो ये सब tax elasticity दर्शा रहा है. Tax elasticity is a general concept of how elastic, how sensitive are taxes with respect to factors that affect taxes. This is tax elasticity. Versus buoyancy क्या है? Buoyancy में हम डिनोमिनेटर को स्पेसिफिक कर देते हैं. इसकी जगह आप क्या आ जाएगा हमारा? परसेंटेज चेंज इन इकोनॉमी, इन जीडीपी. By how much have your taxes grown with your economy growth by a certain amount? That is tax buoyancy. So tax buoyancy and tax elasticity, both concepts are used almost interchangeably. There is a subtle difference. अगर कोई technically पूछेगा तब ये difference बताना, otherwise जबरदस्ती बताने की जरूरत नहीं है. Tax buoyancy, tax elasticity are two concepts, two terms which are used interchangeably. The simple difference is elasticity is a general term, buoyancy is a specific term. Elasticity representing sensitivity of taxes with respect to factors that affect taxes. Buoyancy representing sensitivity of taxes to economic growth. एक specific case है, एक special case है tax buoyancy, tax elasticity का. So because of these factors, our taxes have been really buoyant or elastic, as in they have increased at a reasonably high pace as compared to increase in GDP. Government has been, क्या नाम है chapter का? Revenue relish. Government has been relishing in revenue because of these factors. Extremely important from prelims perspective. Arrange the following taxes in order. ये तो मेरे ख्याल से last to last year सवाल पूछा ही था ये वाला prelims के अंदर. और I think this question is quite common. Arrange the following taxes in order of their contribution to government's total revenues. तो सबसे ज़्यादा contribution कौन सा tax करता है सरकार के revenue में? GST सेंटर और स्टेट दोनों का है. जब हम सेंटर की बात करते हैं तो केवल CGST आता है वहां पे. इसीलिए CGST, GST is 28%, but CGST would become 14%. आधा हो जाएगा इसका. So therefore, सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट के रेवेन्यू में, अब क्वेश्चन इसलिए ध्यान से पढ़ना है कि स्टेटमेंट क्या पूछ रहा है. स्टेटमेंट में whether it is written central government tax revenues or what is written is general government tax revenues, or no government is written, simply what is written is arrange the following taxes in their order of magnitude collected by the government, and there the word written is GST, not SGST, not CGST. तो वो सवाल ध्यान से पढ़ना है वहां पे. केवल अगर GST लिखा है तो yes, GST is the highest, GST then corporate tax then income tax. अगर CGST लिखा है तब then we have corporate tax, then income tax and then CGST or SGST, whatever is written. So make sure that you read the question properly there. Following tax, arrange the following taxes in order of their magnitude. ठीक है, सिंपल सा सवाल है, ये चीज हमको यहां से देखनी है. नंबर याद मत करो 28% है, 26 है, ये नंबर याद मत करो, लेकिन हाँ ये ऑर्डर याद करना बहुत आवश्यक है. दिस इज रिप्रेजेंटिंग ग्रोथ इन टैक्सेस. अगेन ये ट्रेंड बेस्ड क्वेश्चन है, कॉमन सवाल है, ये सब फैक्ट्स है. आई कैनॉट एम्फेसाइज, आई कैनॉट रीड ऑन कीप ऑन रीडिंग दीज फैक्ट्स फॉर यू. यू हैव टू रीड दीज फैक्ट्स योरसेल्फ. If you look at increase in personal income tax, personal income tax has increased at the fastest pace as compared to other taxes. Corporate tax has increased at the rate of around 21%. Personal income tax has increased at the rate of around 26%. तो क्या सवाल पूछा जाएगा एग्जाम के अंदर? Share of personal income taxes as a proportion of total tax collected by the government has increased or decreased. क्या होगा? Increased. ये चीज यहां से पढ़नी है हमको. ये डायग्राम देख के, नंबर देख के नहीं घबराना है, नंबर देख के नहीं इग्नोर करना है, नंबर देख के इन स्टेटमेंट्स को माइंड में फॉर्मुलेट करना है. दैट व्हाट कैन बी द क्वेश्चन आस्क्ड फ्रॉम दिस पर्टिकुलर थिंग. यू लुक एट फॉर एग्जांपल इन दिस दैट हाईएस्ट ग्रोथ रेट हैज बीन ऑफ पर्सनल इनकम टैक्स. दैट मींस नाउ यू कैन इंटरप्रेट दैट share of personal income tax in total tax collected by the government would have increased. This is what you do from this. Clear to all? अगर डिफिकल्ट सवाल पूछना हो तो दे कैन ऑल्सो आस्क दैट व्हाई हैज पर्सनल इनकम टैक्स इंक्रीज एट द फास्टेस्ट पेस. नाउ वन, इट इज अ स्टैटिस्टिक, देयरफॉर देयर इज नो एक्सप्लेनेशन हियर, बट देयर आर पॉसिबल एक्सप्लेनेशंस हियर दैट व्हाई हैज पर्सनल इनकम टैक्स इंक्रीज एट द फास्टेस्ट पेस. नोबडी कैन टेल कि भैया यही रीजन है, लेकिन हाँ कुछ पॉसिबिलिटीज हो सकती है बिकॉज ऑफ विच पर्सनल इनकम टैक्स हैज ग्रोन एट अ फास्टर पेस. व्हाट कैन बी द रीजन? कैन एनीबडी गेस? हाँ, इंक्रीज इन जीडीपी. वो जेनरिक है, थोड़ा और स्पेसिफिक बोलो. ये तो फेसलेस असेसमेंट दैट, ठीक है वो तुमने. इंक्रीज इन एम्प्लॉयमेंट, देखो यही. हाँ बोलो, एक सेकेंड बोलो. इंक्रीज इन टैक्स बेस, गुड. एक सेकेंड बोलो 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 पीछे. लेस कंप्लायंस कॉस्ट, गुड. और क्रिएशन ऑफ अपॉर्चुनिटी, मोर एम्प्लॉयमेंट बेसिकली, ठीक है. और गुड. एग्जाम में ये प्रीलिम्स के अंदर यही स्टेटमेंट्स होंगी. विच ऑफ द फॉलोइंग रीजंस कैन बी एट्रीब्यूटेबल टू अ फास्टर इंक्रीज इन पर्सनल इनकम टैक्स एज कंपेयर टू अदर टैक्सेस. मेक श्योर दैट यू आर एबल टू. मेरे ख्याल से आसान है सवाल, लेकिन आना चाहिए सवाल. एक और कारण है बिकॉज ऑफ विच वी से दैट पर्सनल इनकम टैक्सेस एंड एट द सेम टाइम कॉर्पोरेट टैक्सेस. सी द ग्रोथ ऑफ कॉर्पोरेट टैक्सेस इज आल्सो क्वाइट हाई. डायरेक्ट टैक्सेस जिनकी ग्रोथ 23.9% है, जिसके अंदर कॉर्पोरेट टैक्स ग्रोइंग एट अराउंड 21%, पर्सनल टैक्स ग्रोइंग एट 26%. One more reason is information sharing between government departments. This is one more reason. I file GST. I am a professional and I charge fees from Vision IAS and I take GST from that. And therefore I deposit GST with the government. GST कौन सा टैक्स है? डायरेक्ट या इनडायरेक्ट? इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स है. लेकिन सरकार को मालूम है कि मैंने कितना GST दिया है. इसके कारण सरकार को क्या मालूम है कि मेरा रेवेन्यू कितना हुआ है. Therefore, government is now, because indirect tax department and direct tax department, CBDT and CBIT are now talking to each other. They see my GST return and based on that, they know, they expect that how much amount of income tax should I deposit. Because of these revenue sharing, because of this information sharing, government departments are now able to analyze better about your taxes. I'll assume that none of you has paid taxes. I'll assume that none of you has looked at the income tax return platform. Today, when you look at the income tax return platform, you log into income tax department's website. Do you enter your PAN card? अगर टैक्स देते हो तो फिर आप अपना यूजर नेम क्रिएट कर सकते हो या अपना पैन कार्ड डालो और वहां पे आपकी इनकम का लास्ट ईयर्स का ट्रेंड आ जाएगा. बेस्ड ऑन दैट वहां पे 2 बार ग्राफ बने होंगे. आपका इनकम कितनी थी, आपने कितना टैक्स पे किया है. Based on that, now they can estimate कि next year आपकी इनकम कितनी होगी. Therefore, if you try to evade taxes by showing less amount of income, the department will know that you are evading taxes. How will department make a reasonable guess? The department will talk to GST department and ask them what was the revenue that this person has earned in this particular year. what were the expenses on which he has claimed input tax credit in this particular year. Therefore, income tax department will have a reasonable estimate of how much amount of income has this person earned in a particular year. Therefore, now I am paying more income tax as compared to earlier. That is one more reason that why tax collection is increasing. Why? Because of information sharing between the government departments. One important reason because of which personal income tax is rising at a very fast pace. People paying more taxes because their ability to evade is less. Their ability to evade is less because there is more synchronization between various government departments. As a result of that, your ability to evade paying taxes is less. Okay? जैसे GST में now it is a system that catches the offender. Similarly, using GST system, we can also take a reasonable guess about personal tax that a person is paying. Personal tax, income tax क्या है? वो direct tax है, GST indirect tax है. लेकिन हम उस indirect tax के estimate से direct tax भी estimate कर पा रहे हैं. Therefore, your ability to evade is now reducing. This is one important reason that why our taxes are rising fast. Economic survey के अंदर mention किया हुआ है, passing reference दिया हुआ है, using improved tax administration including artificial intelligence. वहां पे लिखा हुआ है. This is how they use artificial intelligence to predict something from something else, to predict your personal tax liability from your GST resources, from your GST deposited by you. All right? क्या किसी ने कुछ बोला? Okay. This is with respect to GST. As अभी मैंने आपको बताया था वो चार्ट दिखा के ये वाला कि 9.6% इकोनॉमिक ग्रोथ है, 10.9% जीएसटी ग्रोथ है. दिस इज बिकॉज इन दिस पर्टिकुलर वी हैड गॉट -14.1%. अगर इस ईयर को हटा दो देन यू सी दैट you would have a reasonably high growth, overall average growth in GST. Because we have this -14%, hence the overall growth is less. Our average GST collections have increased to around 1.5 lakh crore rupees per month. लगभग 1.5 लाख करोड़ रुपए पर मंथ हम एवरेज जीएसटी कलेक्ट कर रहे हैं. 1.4 के आस 1.4 लाख से ऊपर है, लगभग 1.5 लाख हमारा एवरेज जीएसटी कलेक्शन है. अगेन बिकॉज ऑफ ऑल दोज इलास्टिसिटी एनहांसिंग फीचर ऑफ आवर टैक्स सिस्टम दैट वी डिस्कस अर्लियर. There is one more thing mentioned here in our economic survey. When you look at GST, GST has been buoyant, meaning GST has been growing at a faster pace as compared to GDP, despite the rate of tax in GST being around less than half of what was there in pre-GST regime. In the pre-GST regime, indirect taxes, average excise duty was around 10 to 12%. Average VAT that was being paid was around 12 to 14%. अगर हम सारे गुड्स ले ले जिनके ऊपर वैट लग रहा था तब भी आप एवरेज अराउंड 8% के आसपास वैट पे कर रहे थे. That means the total amount of taxes, now this is pre-GST era where you were paying excise, where you are paying other taxes, where you are paying apart from these sales tax and excise duty, you are paying many entry tax, that is local level taxes also, and then cascading. The tax burden on an individual was around 26 to 30% depending upon different goods. So लगभग average 26 से 30% के आसपास आता था. Versus in the GST regime, the average tax revenue is, the average tax rate is around 11.9%. 11% के आसपास है effective rate. 11.6%. Effective rate on all GST items. We have got many items under various tax rates. किसी के ऊपर 0 है, कुछ exempt है, किसी के ऊपर 5 है, किसी के ऊपर 12 है, 18 है, 28 है, 28 plus cess है, 18 plus cess है. So we have got various items taxed differently. What is the effective rate of GST levied on all items? It is around 11%. 11.6 के आसपास है. At a tax rate of less than half of what was earlier, our GST revenue has been far better as compared to what was earlier. Not just it has been more, it has been growing at a faster pace than what our old revenue was growing. GST revenue is buoyant despite much less tax rate. Buoyancy elasticity, समझ में आ रहा है? How does tax rate affect tax collection? Tax rate कम होने से जरूरी नहीं कि आपके tax collection कम हो जाएगा. Tax rate कम होगा उसके कारण से हो सकता है आपका tax compliance बढ़ जाए. Because your tax administration has improved. Improvement in administration, improvement in compliance will result in greater tax revenues, faster growth of tax revenues despite a fall in tax rates. This is what is demonstrated by GST. A lesser rate, a broader base, doubling of tax base. Around 1.4 crore people are now GST registered. At the time of starting लगभग 70 लाख के आसपास लोग रजिस्टर्ड थे. So हमारा डबल ऑफ टैक्स बेस हो गया है. Despite less than halving of our tax rate, we are collecting more taxes, as in more GST now. This with respect to GST. Other non-tax revenue, again prelims specific information है. जो नॉन टैक्स रेवेन्यू सरकार का वो कम हुआ है. It has decreased during the year. As compared to last year, government's non-tax revenue has decreased. Why has it decreased? In fact, गवर्नमेंट ने बजटेड भी यही किया था. अभी हमने बात करी थी ना कि अंडर द लाइन को ओवर द लाइन लेके आना है. तो सरकार ने यहाँ पे मोर ट्रांसपेरेंटली बजटिंग करी थी. सरकार ने अज्यूम ही किया था बजट में, जब लास्ट ईयर सरकार ने बजट प्रेजेंट किया था on 1st Feb 2022, government assumed that this year we are going to receive less amount of non-tax revenue. They assumed that their non-tax revenue would be less by around 20%, and it is less by around 20% only. So we budgeted for it, and we have got less non-tax revenue. Non-debt capital receipts, basically disinvestment receipts है यहाँ पे. दो receipt होती है non-debt capital receipt. One is disinvestment receipt, and second is loans received by the government that the government had given earlier. Central government had given out a loan to UP government. Now UP government is repaying that loan. So that is money received back by the center. That is also government's non-debt receipt. तो non-debt capital के अंदर major portion disinvestment receipts का होता है. Question for mains or even for prelims can be, why has the government not been able to meet its disinvestments target? Government sets disinvestments targets every year when it presents the budget. बजट में सरकार ये वाले टारगेट्स बताएगी that how much amount of tax we are going to collect, how much non-tax we are going to collect, how much amount of money we are going to borrow, plus how much amount of disinvestments we are going to do, meaning how much amount of capital receipts we are going to incur in a particular year. तो सरकार अपनी कैपिटल रिसीट भी तो बताती है वहां पे. अब कैपिटल रिसीट्स के अंदर नॉन-डेट कैपिटल रिसीट्स, नॉन-डेट कैपिटल के अंदर सरकार बताती है कि दिस ईयर वी आर गोइंग टू डू डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट्स ऑफ 1 लाख करोड़ रुपीस. So last year government announced that we are going to do disinvestment worth 1 lakh crore rupees, whereas till this point, अब तो फाइनेंशियल ईयर खत्म होने वाला है 10 दिन के अंदर अंदर, till this point government has been able to achieve only around 45% of disinvestment target. तो सरकार ने बजट किया था लास्ट ईयर कि हम लगभग 1 लाख करोड़ रुपए का डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट करेंगे. LIC के अंदर अपना स्टेक बेचेंगे, किसी के अंदर भी बेचेंगे, whatever companies we are going to sell our stake in. So government budgeted that they are going to receive disinvestment receipts, disinvestment proceeds of around 1 lakh crore rupees, whereas government has been able to receive only around 50%, 45% of that. The question then is that which of the following can be the reasons of lack of ability to meet disinvestment targets? बताओ क्या क्या कारण हो सकते हैं? Lack of buyers. Okay, good. और उससे क्या होगा? चलो फॉरेनर्स को नहीं बेचनी है, इंडियंस को तो बेच ही सकते हो. चलो गुड, दैट हैज एन इम्प्लीकेशन. बोलो. लो परफॉर्मेंस ऑफ, जिसको सेल करना है उसकी खराब परफॉर्मेंस है तो कोई खरीदने के लिए रेडी नहीं है. गुड. और हाँ, इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर से क्या किस चीज का इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर? इन्वेस्टमेंट थोड़ा ना, तो यहाँ तो बेचना है, सरकार को तो बेचना है, डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट करना है. और हाँ, फॉर द इन्वेस्टर इट इज इन्वेस्टमेंट, हु इज परचेजिंग. हाँ, सो व्हाई शुड इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर मैटर देयर? बोलो. पीछे, लास्ट तुमसे पीछे बोलो. So higher fiscal deficit, therefore less trust, crowding out, inability to borrow because higher cost. Last बोलो. हाँ, पीछे blue t-shirt. Good. बोलो. More rules and regulations for administrative hurdles to purchase. Very good. Or larger NPA. So नहीं, सरकार ने तो कोई कंपनी बेचनी है, सरकार ने तो मेटल्स की कंपनी बेचनी है, एनएमडीसी बेचनी है, या कोई बैंक बेचना है, एसबीआई, पीएनबी, बैंक ऑफ बड़ौदा, उसका कुछ स्टेक बेचना है, तो उसका एनपी से क्या लेना देना? एम्प्लॉइज माइट रेजिस्ट, ऑलराइट। सरकार को तो बेचना है इसमें, फिर सरकार को बेचना है, तो इसमें सरकार की रेवेन्यू सीट्स कहां से बीच में आ गई? अपने आदमी को क्यों बिठाएगी सरकार भाई? नहीं नहीं नहीं, हाँ वो हो गया रेजिस्टेंस फ्रॉम द एम्प्लॉइज। बोलो लास्ट। Society's bias, okay. Political pressure, okay. The major reason that why disinvestment targets are not met, one definitely is pressure from employees and political pressure. That is one major reason. However, political pressure or pressure from employees can be overcome if the government has a will to do that. तो वो तो बिहेवियरल एस्पेक्ट है, उसके ऊपर हम चर्चा नहीं करेंगे कि भाई विल है तो आप कर सकते हो उस चीज को। एम्प्लॉय प्रेशर हो, चाहे पब्लिक प्रेशर हो, चाहे पॉलिटिकल प्रेशर हो, विल है तो आप उसको कर सकते हो। देयर इज एन इकोनॉमिक रीजन हियर। इकोनॉमिक रीजन हियर इज इम्प्रॉपर वैल्यूएशन। Market conditions will determine that what is the value of your asset that you're going to sell. Let's say government wants to sell SBI, not SBI fully, but let's say government has at this moment 80% ownership of SBI and government wants to reduce it to 70%. मतलब सरकार अपना 10% शेयर बेचना चाहती है। The market conditions are not good, meaning because of rising interest rates by Federal Reserve, there is a lot of pulling out of money happening in the Indian economy. As a result of that, FIIs, they are selling their stakes in Indian assets. Therefore, when FIIs sell, supply increase होगी तो प्राइस क्या होगा? Supply increase, price comes down. FIIs are selling the, let's say some FII had purchased SBI. FIIs had shares of SBI. Now that FII wants to sell its shares of SBI and take back that money to invest in USA. So therefore FII is selling its stake in SBI. When FII sells its stake in SBI, what happens to supply of SBI's shares in the market? SBI's share in the market increase, supply increases. Supply of shares increases, what happens to price of those shares? Decreases. सब लोग अगर बेच रहे हैं तो इसका मतलब क्या है? Price of those shares will come down. If price of those shares come down, that means will government be able to sell? SBI का शेयर सरकार ने जब बेचने का प्लान किया था तब SBI का शेयर 600 रुपए का था, लेकिन अब because of FIIs selling their shares in the market, SBI's share prices come down from 600 to 500 rupees. As a result of that, now can the government sell? It can't sell. Why? Because if government sells at 500 rupees, next day in media you will hear the news that सरकार ने SBI को आधे पौने दाम में बेच दिया है. So political pressure or public pressure can be taken out. However, economic pressure is a real pressure. Economic pressure is that what is the value that you realize when you sell your asset. If in the economy there is, let's say, general recession, I have land, the value of my land earlier was 10 crore rupees, and now in the economy there is recession. As a result of that, there are no buyers for my land. If I want to sell my land now, I will be able to sell it for 5 crore rupees. अगर मैं वो land 5 crore में बेच आता हूं, given कि मेरे को मेरे घर वाले मना कर रहे हैं कि land मत बेचो, और मैं उसके बाद भी 5 करोड़ में बेच आता हूं, तो फिर मैं घर पे जाऊंगा तो क्या होगा? जबरदस्ती बेचा है, थोड़ी देर वेट कर लेते, you could have received much more amount अगर बेचना ही था तो. So if government sells its ownership in its companies at a price which is less because market conditions are not adequate, market conditions are very volatile, they are not stable. As a result of that, government will not be able to realize the resources which it expected to realize by selling the stake. Hence, government will not do disinvestment. The major reason for disinvestment not taking place is government is not able to realize the expected value of the assets from the market. I want to sell Air India at a certain price. However, there is no buyer at that price because market conditions are not good. I have not set unrealistic expectation from selling of Air India. I want to sell Air India. ऐसा नहीं कि मैंने अपने मन में बना लिया कि भी ये तो देश का प्राइड है इसीलिए एयर इंडिया को तो मैं 1 लाख करोड़ से नीचे बेचूंगा ही नहीं. एयर इंडिया का डेट ही 50,000 करोड़ रुपए का है, तो कोई क्यों खरीदेगा एयर इंडिया को 1 लाख करोड़ रुपए के अंदर. So therefore, when I have to sell that company, Air India, then I cannot set unrealistic expectations. लेकिन ऐसा भी नहीं है कि मैं zero expectations रखूं. I will have some expectations that I will be able to sell my asset at a particular price. I will be able to realize that price only when market conditions are favorable. If market conditions are unfavorable, then I will not be able to sell my asset at the desirable price. Is it clear? This is the major reason for disinvestment targets not being realized by in many years by the government. Is it clear? Next is, we have discussed now government's receipts, tax receipts, non-tax receipts, all debt receipts, जो fiscal deficit वाला part था. And now let's quickly look at government's expenses. Government expenses, one part, the running theme is, we discussed it yesterday, capital expenses have been going up. Capital expenses as a proportion of GDP have increased to around 2.9%. They have more than doubled since past few years. अगर हम एवरेज लें तो कैपिटल एक्सपेंसेस वर अबाउट 1.7% ऑफ जीडीपी एंड दे आर नाउ अराउंड 2.9%. बीच में कम हो गए थे काफी, इसलिए मैंने बोला मोर देन डबल. बट हाँ, अगर हम 10 साल का एवरेज लें तो कैपिटल एक्सपेंसेस वर अबाउट 1.7% व्हिच हैव इंक्रीज्ड टू अराउंड 2.9%. वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट टू नोट. रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंसेस, amount of expenses have increased but their proportion of total budget has decreased. This is share of capital expenses in total budget. Share FY18 में capital expenses were around 12.3%. That means revenue around 87.7%. Capital expense were around 12.1%. That means revenue were around 87.9%. Today capital are around 19%. That means revenue are around 81%. So share of capital is increasing since last few years. We see that capital expenses growing at a much faster pace. As a proportion of GDP, they comprise more. As a proportion of total expenditure, they comprise more. Revenue expenses in magnitude term obviously are rising, but their share in total expenses, their share in GDP, that is falling. These are major areas on which government is spending capital expenses. देख लेना एक बार कि अब एग्जाम में सिंपली पूछा जा सकता है कि किसके ऊपर सबसे ज्यादा खर्चा किया जा रहा है. अरेंज द फॉलोइंग. आई एम श्योर पहला गैस तो सब लोग कर ही सकते हो कि सबसे ज्यादा रोड ट्रांसपोर्ट एंड हाईवे के ऊपर हो रहा होगा. दूसरा वाला एक बार देख लेना क्या है. दूसरा इज रेलवेज. तीसरा, सॉरी ये वाला पार्ट देखो, BFI23. दूसरा इज डिफेंस सर्विसेज कैपिटल आउटले. सो दिस इज इंपॉर्टेंट. Defense services capital outlay, this has increased. It was 0.73 earlier, it is 1.52 now. It was 1.15 earlier, it is 1.37 now. lakh crore rupees के अंदर. So therefore, biggest component is road transport and highways. Second component this year is defense services. Third component this year is railways. ठीक है, तो ये चीज एक बार नोट कर लेना. This is capital expense. Now this is revenue expense of the government. Revenue expenses increased drastically during the pandemic because government has to spend more money on welfare, subsidies, etc. So revenue expenses are increased हुए हैं. Now we are bringing down our revenue expenses. In FY20 जो pandemic वाला year है, in FY21, our revenue expenses increased drastically. In FY22 we brought them down. But in FY23, मतलब जो इस समय फाइनेंशियल ईयर चल रहा है, जो खत्म होने वाला है 1 अप्रैल को, in this particular year again the need for government intervention increased because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. As a result of that, more money has to be spent on subsidy purposes. Therefore this year revenue expenses have increased again. From coming down last year, they are increasing this year again. But yes, on an overall basis revenue expenses हमारे अभी भी कम हो रहे हैं. We budgeted revenue expense to come down to around 15%, but this year we are going to exceed that budgeted estimate. In FY21 revenue expenses हमारे लगभग 17% के आसपास थे. In FY21 revenue expenses were around 17%. Our 17% of GDP. In FY21 pandemic वाला year जो है financial year 2020-21, our average revenue expenses as a percentage of GDP have been around 12 to 12.5%. एवरेज रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंसेस मतलब 10 साल का एवरेज लगभग 12.5% के आसपास है. फर्स्ट. सेकंड, जो पैंडेमिक वाला ईयर है उस ईयर के अंदर ड्रास्टिकली इंक्रीज टू अराउंड 17% ऑफ जीडीपी इन दैट ईयर. नेक्स्ट ईयर FY22 वी बजटेड टू ब्रिंग इट डाउन टू अराउंड 16% ऑफ जीडीपी. नेक्स्ट ईयर FY23 जो भी खत्म होने वाला है, वी बजटेड टू ब्रिंग इट डाउन टू अराउंड 15% ऑफ GDP. But this year we are going to exceed this 15% target. Why? Because of excessive money required during this year. सरकार ने जब बजट प्रेजेंट किया था तब जो सब्सिडी का एक्सपेंडिचर था अराउंड 2 लाख करोड़ के आसपास था. During the year, the government asked for supplementary grants from Parliament on account of these subsidies, food subsidy, fertilizer subsidy, because of increased cost of natural gas, therefore fertilizers, natural gas, etc. Therefore, our subsidy expenditure this year is again going to be high. As a result of that, our revenue expenditure this year is again going to be high. I'm repeating these things. I don't think so कि आपसे पूछा जाएगा कि revenue expense ज़्यादा है कम है, बट हाँ कॉम्पोनेंट जरूर पूछा जा सकते हैं, ट्रेंड के बारे में जरूर पूछा जा सकता है एग्जाम के अंदर, तो ध्यान रखना इन चीजों का. Subsidy expenditure is being rationalized back to pre-pandemic level. It was around 3.6% in FY21 to around 1.9% in FY22. It was budgeted to reduce to 1.2% in FY23 subsidy expenditure, but will be more due to high burden because of higher commodity prices. ठीक है. Next component of our revenue expenditure is interest payment. If you look at components of revenue expense, the major components are interest payments, salaries and subsidies. ये 3 major component, and defense expenditure obviously. Interest payment is the biggest component of our total revenue expenses. Interest payment as a component of our revenue expenses was down, but because of more borrowing during past few years, obviously it is going to go up. हमारा interest as a percentage of total expense, as a percentage of total revenue expense, as a percentage of GDP, everything, interest expenses are going up. Why? Because we have borrowed more in past. We borrowed more, as in last 2 years we borrowed more. Our fiscal deficit was 9.2. That means we have borrowed more. Plus we borrowed, बहुत ज्यादा borrow करना पड़ा था हमको. जब ज्यादा borrow करोगे तो cost of borrowing क्या होगी? कम या ज्यादा? ज्यादा होगी. So our cost of borrowing was also not sustainable as much, and therefore because we borrowed in FY21, therefore it is going to lead to excessive burden upon us in form of interest payment. We expect that कि हमारी interest payment जो इतनी अभी 41 के आसपास है, इससे ऊपर अब नहीं जानी चाहिए. It has reached its peak. From now onwards it is going to come down. इसके बारे में हम लास्ट में बात करेंगे where you talk about sustainability of debt वाला part. But yes, interest payments as a proportion of total expenses have been increasing. States finances, I'm not going to spend any time on this. These are there in slides in your material. You can have a look from that. State finances, states का fiscal deficit, like there is FRBM Act for center, there is FRBL for states also. Every state has a respective fiscal responsibility and budget legislation. जैसे center की FRBM है, वैसे ही states की FRBL है. Under that FRBL, states are also required to restrain their fiscal deficit to within 3% of GDP. Like center का 3% है, इसी तरह states का भी 3% है. सेंटर का डेट टू जीडीपी रेशियो आइडली शुड बी 40%, स्टेट्स का आइडली शुड बी 20% ऑफ देयर जीएसडीपी. ओवरऑल डेट टू जीडीपी रेशियो ऑफ सेंटर प्लस स्टेट कंबाइंड शुड बी 60%, 20 फॉर स्टेट्स, 40 फॉर सेंटर. व्हेन यू लुक एट स्टेट्स फिस्कल डेफिसिट, स्टेट्स डेफिसिट्स हैव अगेन स्टार्टेड टू कम डाउन आफ्टर राइजिंग ड्यूरिंग द पैंडेमिक ईयर. जैसे सेंटर का 9.2 हो गया था, स्टेट्स का 4.1 हो गया था. And now it has come down. Last year it has increased again because of higher expenditure requirements upon states as well, like center. So last year it increased a little bit. When you look at states' fiscal deficit, states' fiscal deficit are supposed to be within 3% of GDP as part of their FRBLs. Apart from this, states have been given some additional borrowing capability if they pursue certain reforms. This was part of Atmanirbhar Bharat package plus also part of Finance Commission recommendations. Under Atmanirbhar Bharat package, central government said that states have a limit of 3%. Under FRBL, states have a limit of 3%. Plus, apart from that, states were given additional 0.5%, then 0.5, then 0.5, then 0.5. States were given additional borrowing limits in case they pursue certain reforms. Plus, apart from that, additional limits were granted to them by Finance Commission also, again because of certain good expenses if they incur. तो states को सरकार ने allow किया कि आप ज़्यादा borrow कर सकते हो, provided आप ये कुछ reforms करो. आप बोरो करके अपने स्टाफ को सैलरी नहीं दो, आप बोरो करके कुछ अच्छी जगह एक्सपेंडिचर करो, यू इनकर सम रिफॉर्म्स, therefore we are going to revise your borrowing limits upwards as well. Many states have been able to utilize this excessive limit given to them under this Atmanirbhar Bharat package. Many states have been able to borrow more than 3%, that is what their deficit target was. Why? Because they have been able to pursue those reforms. They can ask a question in mains regarding this, that discuss the ability of states to improve their finances vis-a-vis center's ability. When it comes to center's ability to finance its deficit, when it comes to center's ability to borrow money from the market, ज्यादा easy terms में कौन borrow कर सकता है, center या state? Center can borrow easily. Center's ability to improve its finances is far better as compared to states. How can states be nudged to improve their finances? ये सवाल मेन में पूछा सकता है. Ability of states to improve their finances vis-a-vis center's ability, or how can states be nudged to improve their finances? Central government has increased the borrowing limits of states. It has increased those borrowing limits by asking them to pursue certain reforms, by asking them to incur capital expenditure. For example, if states implement certain ease of doing business reforms, तो states extra borrow कर सकते हैं. अगर state ease of doing business reforms implement करते हैं, तो what is going to happen to investment in that state? Increase. If investment increases, what is going to happen to revenues of that state? Improve, right? So therefore, states can improve their finances by undertaking this reform. Finance Commission says that you incur capital expenditure and therefore you can borrow more. Center can give you more transfers. Center is giving 50-year interest-free loans to states. Cooperative federalism. Center is giving 50-year interest-free loans to state so that states can spend that money in capital expenditure. If states incur that expenditure, what is going to happen to investments in that state or general ability of states to do business, people in that state to do business? Improve. Hence, what happens to revenues of that state? Improve. This is how you improve state government's ability to meet its targets in the fiscal deficit. State का target 3% कैसे meet होगा? States borrow नहीं कर सकते sustainably. States finances are already in poor shape. How do you improve that finances? Those finances, you nudge the states towards that thing. By themselves, state finances improve नहीं होने वाले हैं. By themselves, states will simply keep on their dependency on the center, that you give us money and we will splurge this money. By themselves, state finances are not going to mend themselves. State finances can be mend only when center nudges them. How does center nudges them? Behavioral economics hai. How does center nudges them? Center nudges them by asking them to take certain reforms and giving them some incentive to take those reforms. What is the incentive? You introduce this reform, you are allowed to borrow more. You introduce this reform, allowed to borrow even more. You introduce power sector reforms. Major drain on state finances is power companies. Delhi government says that we are going to provide electricity free of cost. How can distribution companies in Delhi provide electricity free of cost? They have to purchase electricity. That means they have to give money to somebody. Delhi government would therefore give money to them. Delhi government बोलेगी हमारे पास तो खुद पैसा नहीं है, एक काम करो आप मार्केट से आके बोरो कर लो. मार्केट आपको नहीं देगी, आप मार्केट में जाके बोलो कि मेरे को ये चीज फ्री में प्रोवाइड करनी है इसलिए मुझे पैसा दो, कोई आपको पैसा नहीं देगा. So therefore Delhi government will then give a guarantee for your borrowing. When Delhi government gives a guarantee, what happens to Delhi government's ability to borrow then? Delhi government ने अपनी पावर डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन कंपनी की ओर से गारंटी दे रखी है कि जो इस कंपनी ने लोन दिया है, अभी जैसे हमने बात करी थी इंडियन ऑयल की, इंडियन गवर्नमेंट ने इंडियन ऑयल की गारंटी दे रखी है कि जो इंडियन ऑयल ने लोन दिया है उस लोन को हम वापस करेंगे. दिल्ली गवर्नमेंट ने पावर कंपनी की गारंटी दे रखी है कि जो इस पावर कंपनी ने लोन लिया है उस लोन को हम वापस करेंगे. So therefore, if now Delhi government wants to borrow something on its own, what happens to its capability to borrow? It reduces. It's quite less now. Why? Because it is giving guarantees for others. How do you nudge Delhi government to improve its finances then? अगर अब उसके बाद Delhi government को borrow करना है, so what will be its cost of borrowing? ज्यादा होगी, कोई भी लेंडर होगा बोलेगा मैं आपको दूंगा पैसा लेकिन आपको हायर कॉस्ट के ऊपर दूंगा. सो state governments will incur debt at a higher cost as compared to center. Their finances are in poor shape. How do you nudge them? How do you bring them on right track? You nudge them by asking them to take certain reforms and give them incentives to take those reforms. Improve your utilities, power utilities, and as a result of that, you can borrow. If you do those reforms, you can borrow more. Incur capital expenditure. Implement ease of doing business reforms in your state. If you do these reforms, your ability to borrow would be more. Hence, state governments would be nudged to incur these reforms. Therefore, this will result in improving of their finances. ये है cooperative federalism. When we talk about other aspects of जो normal aspect of cooperative federalism का, which is transfers to states, I'm sure everybody knows finance commission transfers and any other transfers from center to states. One, सबसे पहले finance commission अपने devolution करता है, जो grants, जो not grants, devolution of net proceed of taxes. Center has collected 100 rupees of tax. Out of that, 50 rupees, finance commission says that 90 rupees, 10 rupees is the cost of collection. 90 rupees is the net proceed of taxes. Out of that, 45 rupees, finance commission says that these are going to states as part of devolution. From the remaining 45, finance commission recommends more devolution also. केवल 45 रुपीज जो नेट प्रोसीड ऑफ टैक्सेस है केवल वही डिस्ट्रीब्यूट नहीं किया है, उसके सिवा आर्टिकल 275 के तहत भी डिस्ट्रीब्यूट किया है. डिस्क्रेशनरी ग्रांट्स, revenue filling grants, some sector specific grants. So finance commission gives more transfers to states apart from the simple devolution, the normal devolution that it recommends. These are various ways in which center gives money to states. Finance commission devolution, finance commission recommendation of grants under article 275, centrally sponsored schemes, and any other transfer to state in form of grants or loans. Implementation of schemes, CSS, centrally sponsored scheme. All these are central government's transfer to states. CSS, finance commission grants and other loans or transfers. This is a mains question that has been asked earlier. I think it was asked in 2018, 2019. I think 2019 में पूछा गया था. In paper 2, not in paper 3. Regarding GST and rights of states. Does GST result in greater revenue for the states? Does GST, no क्यों बोल रहे हो यार, सही में ज्यादा है भाई, अभी तो बताया भी तो है बयान से. हाँ, तुम्हारे दिमाग में क्या चल रहा था बियॉन्ड से? Does GST result in greater revenues for state? First, does GST result in loss of sovereign powers of state? Is GST contrary to the idea of federalism or fiscal federalism? So this question was asked in GS paper 2. That these were not the wordings, but obviously the question to this regard was asked in GS paper 2. They asked the paper in GS paper 3 as well regarding revenue implications of GST. Paper 3 में पूछा था regarding revenue implication of GST. Paper 2 में पूछा था regarding the state's rights and state finances with respect to GST. तो ये सवाल 2 बार पूछा गया है GST के ऊपर. This particular thing helps us to answer this question. What has happened to, अब हमारे पास डेटा है पिछले 5 सालों का, जब से जीएसटी इंप्लीमेंट हुआ है. What has happened to devolution to states when it comes to pre-GST regime and post-GST regime? अभी जो पहला चार्ट बताया था जहां पे टैक्स बायनेंसी दिखाई थी, वहां पे बताया था कि ओवरऑल इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स रेवेन्यू कैसे चेंज हुआ है. प्री जीएसटी कितना इनडायरेक्ट टैक्सेस था और पोस्ट जीएसटी कितना इनडायरेक्ट टैक्सेस है. सो वी सी दैट पोस्ट जीएसटी इनडायरेक्ट टैक्सेस आर ग्रोइंग एट अ फास्टर पेस एज कंपेयर्ड टू ग्रोथ इन जीडीपी, दैट इज देयर इज बायनेंसी. यहां पे हम क्या बात कर रहे हैं? हम बात करें यहां पे स्टेट को डिवोल्यूशन की, दैट वेदर डिवोल्यूशन टू स्टेट्स हैज इंक्रीज्ड और नॉट. प्री जीएसटी, पोस्ट जीएसटी, वी सी दैट growth of states receipts from center plus states own funds. स्टेट पहले वैट कलेक्ट कर रहा था, वो स्टेट का अपना पैसा था, प्लस सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट वाज ट्रांसफरिंग इट्स शेयर ऑफ टैक्सेस टू स्टेट्स, वो भी स्टेट के पास जा रहा था. तो स्टेट के पास मेजर 2 सोर्स ऑफ रेवेन्यू था. वन, स्टेट गवर्नमेंट्स ओन टैक्सेस व्हिच वाज सेल्स टैक्स बेसिकली, एंड सेकंड इट्स डिवोल्यूशन कर्टेसी द फाइनेंस कमीशन. These were the tax receipts of states versus post GST. Now we have got just SGST plus IGST का component जो state को जाता है. We have these things that go to the state. SGST plus IGST के अंदर state का component है. तो ये चीज अब state के पास जा रही है. When you compare the money received by states pre GST and post GST, money received by state, receipt का मतलब क्या है? पहले स्टेट का वैट प्लस सेंटर के द्वारा डिवॉल्यूशन, अब स्टेट का एसजीएसटी प्लस आईजीएसटी में सेंटर के द्वारा डिवॉल्यूशन. When you look at the money received by state, here also we see that there is greater buoyancy as compared to earlier. Yeah. The total amount, the growth in nominal GDP is 9.6% versus the transfers to states, SGST plus IGST for state plus devolution from central GST. Transfers to states have grown by around 10.9%, meaning our growth is less, transfers have grown at a faster pace, meaning that there is more buoyancy. ये जो बाकी वाला पार्ट है कॉम्पनसेशन है, जो कॉम्पनसेशन सेस वाला पार्ट है, बाकी जो यहाँ पे देख रहे हैं ना कम 8.9 है, 8.9 है, 8.9 है कॉम्पनसेशन मिला के. कॉम्पनसेशन जो कॉम्पनसेशन सेस है, जो शॉर्टफॉल वाली चीज है, बिकॉज स्टेट्स हैड टू बोरो मोर मनी ड्यूरिंग पैंडेमिक, सेंटर बोरोड ऑन देयर बिहाफ एंड द सेंटर ट्रांसफर दैट मनी. तो कॉम्पनसेशन वाला पार्ट है. कॉम्पनसेशन को हम यहाँ पे इंक्लूड नहीं कर रहे हैं, हम यहाँ पे स्टेट के टैक्सेस को देख रहे हैं केवल. SGST plus IGST for states plus devolution from center's GST. These things have grown by around 10.9%, whereas economy has grown by around 9.6%, meaning that we have got a greater buoyancy here as compared to earlier where buoyancy was less than 1. यहाँ पे 1.13 है और earlier around 0.9 के आसपास buoyancy थी. As in pre-GST money received by the states growing at around 0.9% of the rate of growth of GDP versus growing at the rate of around 1.13% at the rate of plus the rate of GDP growth. So therefore, we have got buoyancy here in terms of states revenue when it comes to the post GST regime. Post GST, as in after GST, states receipts have increased, have been growing at a faster pace as compared to earlier regime. Therefore, GST is not compromising upon states revenue. It is definitely a win-win situation for states as well. This we have discussed. Enhanced limits for states to borrow. These are various allocations under these enhanced limits. Last part of this chapter, government की debt का sustainability analysis. This is the important part. This is I think the most important part of this chapter. पहले वाला part जो है वो prelims point of view से important है, ये वाला part main से important point of view है. Last part, sustainability analysis of government's debt. Government incurs debt, कल हमने बात करी थोड़ी सी इस बारे में. When government incurs debt, when anybody incurs debt, that leads to crowding out. The manner in which it is spent can lead to crowding in as well. ये भी हमने बात करी थी. Plus, when you incur excessive debt, that leads to intergenerational and intragenerational inequity. I borrow more today. Today's borrowing will be repaid by future generations. Hence, intergenerational inequity. आज बोरो कर रहे हो लेकिन टैक्स लगेगा फ्यूचर जनरेशन के ऊपर पे करने के लिए. इंटरजेनरेशनल इनइक्विटी फर्स्ट. सेकंड, इंट्राजेनरेशनल क्यों है? बिकॉज ऑफ क्राउडिंग आउट. Government borrows, it leads to higher cost of borrowing of the remaining money for the economy. Therefore, only those who can afford that higher cost will be able to borrow. Hence, intra-generation inequity. Further, when government borrows money and government spends that money, this will result in more inflation in the economy. As a result of inflation, the poor suffer more as compared to the non-poor. Therefore, again, intra-generational inequity. So, debt causes intergenerational and intra-generational inequity. First. डेट इज ऑल्सो एसेंशियल. सरकार को खर्च भी करना है बोरो करके खर्च भी करना है, लेकिन बोरो बहुत ज्यादा भी नहीं करना है. इट मस्ट बी विद इन सस्टेनेबल लिमिट. हाउ डू वी असेस दैट वेदर डेट इज सस्टेनेबल और नॉट? यू नीड टू बोरो मोर बिकॉज द टाइम्स आर सच दैट यू नीड टू बोरो मोर. प्रेजेंट जनरेशन को मार तो नहीं सकते हैं ना ये बोल के कि भाई फ्यूचर जनरेशन के ऊपर बर्डन पड़ेगा. तो यू हैव टू बोरो मोर एंड स्पेंड एट प्रेजेंट. If present generation is well off, chances are this will spill over to the next generation as well. You calculate the trade-off here. How much can be borrowed and how much can be spent today, so that in general the positive effects are more as compared to negative effects. Debt sustainable है या नहीं है? You check for debt sustainability. Government is borrowing and spending. It should not borrow excessively and spend excessively. It should borrow within limits. What is this limit? How do you check for sustainability? There are various debt sustainability parameters. For example, you look at the overall debt to GDP ratio. Your overall debt to GDP ratio should be less. Our debt to GDP ratio was less, declining in fact, but because of pandemic, it increased sharply. It is coming back down. We say that it is within sustainable limits. Why do we say that it is within sustainable limits? Let's have a look now. ये फैक्ट है कि हमारी डेट टू जीडीपी रेशियो सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट की अराउंड 56% है, जनरल गवर्नमेंट की अराउंड 80 to 83% के आसपास है. लास्ट ईयर इट वाज 89%. आई थिंक दिस ईयर इट हैज डिक्लाइन टू अराउंड 82%. अच्छा यहाँ पे है लास्ट टू लास्ट ईयर 89% थी, दिस ईयर अराउंड 86.5%. दिस इज जनरल गवर्नमेंट डेट टू जीडीपी रेशियो, सेंटर प्लस स्टेट्स कंबाइंड. दिस is central GDP ratio, central debt to GDP ratio only. These are various components of debt. Government debt is called as public debt. Public debt has two components, internal debt and external public debt. Internal means debt sourced from internal sources, what residents owe to the government, what government owes to the resident, that is internal debt. External is what government has borrowed from external sources, that is external debt. इसको बोलते हैं एक्सटर्नल पब्लिक डेट या फिर सॉवरन एक्सटर्नल डेट, एक्सटर्नल डेट ऑफ गवर्नमेंट. देयर आर अदर लायबिलिटीज ऑफ द गवर्नमेंट अपार्ट फ्रॉम पब्लिक डेट व्हिच वी कॉल एज अदर लायबिलिटीज. अदर लायबिलिटीज क्या होता है? द मनी दैट गवर्नमेंट होल्ड्स एज अ कस्टोडियन ऑफ द पब्लिक, दैट इज कॉल्ड एज अदर लायबिलिटीज. फॉर एग्जांपल, अंडर NSSF, नेशनल स्मॉल सेविंग फंड्स, you have your pension account. In your pension account you deposit some money every month, your employer deposits money every month. That money is your money, but that money is lying with the government. Government has promised that depending upon your contribution and time period of your contribution, you will get some pension when you retire. Depending upon your contribution and the time period, you have contributed in some provident fund, in some infrastructure debt fund which is there with the government. तो आपने सरकार को कुछ पैसा दे रखा है और उसके ऊपर आपको सरकार ने कुछ guaranteed return promise कर रखा है. वो पैसा आपका, it is your money. Your money lying with the government. Government has not technically gone to you and borrowed that money. You simply, government has provided a facility to you and you have availed that facility of depositing that money with the government. Therefore, your money with the government, your money that the government holds as a custodian. These are what are public account. These are what are other liabilities of the government. Public account of India के ऊपर other liabilities. For example, under NSSF, National Small Saving Funds. This is government's debt. Government debt का मतलब क्या है? जो सरकार ने खुद जाके borrow किया है versus other liability जो सरकार के पास पैसा अपने आप आ गया है, सरकार ने borrow नहीं किया है. When we talk about government's debt, we look at total debt, public debt plus other liabilities. These are total liabilities of the government. सरकार की total liabilities लगभग कितनी है? 134 lakh crore rupees, which is around FY22 provisional estimate, which is around 56% debt to GDP ratio of the government of India. ठीक है? These are numbers. Whether these numbers are sustainable or not, how do we assess this sustainability? There are multiple parameters that we look at. Debt sustainability, principles of debt management. बताओ. NK सिंह नहीं थी. हाँ, लेकिन वो NK सिंह नहीं है, वो तो प्रिंसिपल्स, जनरल प्रिंसिपल्स है. वो तो लास्ट प्रिंसिपल था, उससे पहले भी कई सारे प्रिंसिपल्स थे. चलो कोई बात नहीं, कोई बात नहीं. There are students whom I have not taught, plus this lecture is going to go on YouTube, so there are other students also. I'll have to repeat all those principles. When you talk about debt sustainability, how do we assess that whether debt level is sustainable or not? We look at certain principles. First is least cost, obviously, कि debt सबसे कम cost का होना चाहिए. कितनी कम cost वो हम थोड़ी देर बाद डिस्कस करेंगे, वो लास्ट प्रिंसिपल के अंदर आ जाता है. कितनी कम cost का होना चाहिए वो लास्ट पार्ट है. पहला तो ऑब्वियस चीज है कि जब आप उधार ले रहे हो तो सबसे कम कीमत का होना चाहिए, फर्स्ट. सेकंड इज व्हेन यू टेक लोन, यू प्रेफर दैट लोन शुड बी टेकन फ्रॉम डोमेस्टिक सोर्सेस. एज फार एज पॉसिबल योर इंटरनल डेट शुड बी मोर एज कंपेयर टू योर एक्सटर्नल डेट. दिस इज योर इंटरनल डेट, दिस इज योर एक्सटर्नल डेट. इंटरनल कॉम्पोनेंट ज्यादा होना चाहिए, एक्सटर्नल कॉम्पोनेंट कम होना चाहिए, एज फार एज पॉसिबल. विद इन योर एक्सटर्नल कॉम्पोनेंट, फर्दर थर्ड प्रिंसिपल, आपने बोरोइंग करी है बाहर से, एज इन फॉरेनर से, विद इन योर एक्सटर्नल कंपोनेंट, एज मच एज पॉसिबल इट शुड बी सोर्स्ड फ्रॉम, इट शुड बी सोर्स्ड इन डोमेस्टिक करेंसी. First principle, debt should be incurred at least cost. Second, as far as possible, incurred from domestic sources, that is internal debt. Third, as far as possible, your external debt should be sourced in domestic currency. अगर फॉरेनर से भी पैसा ले रहे हो उधार, तो कोशिश करो कि फॉरेनर आपको रुपए में पैसा दे, ना कि डॉलर में पैसा दे. कोशिश करो. फॉरेनर के पास जो भी करेंसी है फॉरेनर वही देगा, बट हाँ, यू शुड एटलीस्ट ट्राई दैट द व्हेन फॉरेनर lends money to you, foreigner should be lending in rupees, debt denominated in rupees. Fourth, you look at the maturity profile of debt. Your debt should be preferably maturing in a long duration, not in a short duration. Debt की maturity profile long होनी चाहिए. Long का मतलब क्या है? Most of your debt should have to be repaid in long term, not in short term. If I had borrowed 100 rupees and I'm supposed to repay these 100 rupees in next 2 years, that means अगले 2 साल में मेरे ऊपर काफी ज्यादा burden आने वाला है repayment का. Why? Because I have to pay not just interest plus principal as well. Versus if I have to pay this 100 rupees in next 20 years, तो मैं 20 साल तक interest pay करूंगा और उसके बाद मेरे ऊपर principal का burden आएगा. Obviously, I will end up paying more interest, but at least I would not be burdened to pay large amount of principal in the immediate term. So preferably speaking, when we look at debt's maturity profile, we want it that it should be as long as possible. Long profile का मतलब क्या है? That your debt should be maturing in long term. It should not be maturing in short term. Maturing का मतलब क्या हुआ? It should have to be repaid. You have incurred some debt. You incurred some debt this year, last year, last to last year, year before that, 20 years before today, 30 years before today. इंदिरा गांधी जी ने लोन लिया था, मान लेते हैं 1 लाख रुपए का, उसमें से अभी तक केवल 50,000 का पे हुआ है, तो प्रेजेंट गवर्नमेंट और फ्यूचर गवर्नमेंट उसका बचा हुआ 50,000 पे करती रहेगी. सो देयरफॉर व्हेन वी टॉक अबाउट debt profile, maturity profile, we say that preferably it should be long term in nature, meaning the principal amount has to be paid in long term, preferably as compared to short term. Why? Because if it has to be paid in short term, it is going to put pressure upon government expenses. अगर आपको इंटरेस्ट के साथ साथ प्रिंसिपल भी पे करना पड़ गया, तो आप फिर बाकी एक्सपेंस कहां से इनकर कर पाओगे? आपके बाकी एक्सपेंस नॉन डिस्क्रिशनरी है, सैलरी आपको देनी है, इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट करना है, डिफेंस एक्सपेंडिचर करना है, पेंशंस देनी है. How would you be able to incur other expenses if your debt profile is short? So therefore, preferably it should be long debt profile. This is how we assess sustainability of debt. Let's see how does India's debt fare on this. First is component of domestic sources. We see that around 95% debt is from internal and 4% is from external source. 4.9 is internal source, external sources. Therefore, as far as external debt is concerned, that is very, very less as compared to the total debt. Therefore, completely sustainable on this particular regard. Within this external debt, ये हमारा जो भी external debt और plus internal debt also. When we look at external debt, almost all of the external debt is from institutional sources. That means entities like World Bank, IMF से हमारा कोई लोन नहीं है, और Asian Development Bank और Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. Most of the external debt of the government, देश की बात नहीं कर रहा हूँ, सरकार की बात कर रहा हूँ, सरकार का external debt जो है, जो सरकार का एक्सटर्नल डेट है, दिस इज मोस्टली फ्रॉम इंस्टीट्यूशनल सोर्स, मोस्टली क्या, एंटायरली फ्रॉम इंस्टीट्यूशनल सोर्सेस, वर्ल्ड बैंक और एडीबी और ब्रिक्स बैंक, दैट इज एआईआईबी एक्सेट्रा. Since it is from institutional sources, that means it has been incurred at a low cost, plus it has been incurred at a fixed cost. When World Bank has lent money to us, World Bank is not charging a market linked interest. Market cost of borrowing बढ़ रही है, कम हो रही है. कल बात करी थी हमने, आरबीआई रेजिंग इंटरेस्ट रेट्स, फेडरल रिजर्व रेजिंग इंटरेस्ट रेट, एज अ रिजल्ट ऑफ दैट कॉस्ट ऑफ बोरिंग फॉर एवरीबडी इज राइजिंग इंक्लूडिंग द गवर्नमेंट. बट गवर्नमेंट्स एक्सटर्नल डेट is sourced from institutions which charge a fixed rate of interest. Therefore, our external debt is not prone to all these vulnerabilities because of market interest rate. Market interest rate बढ़ रहा है, उससे हमको कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ेगा. Why? Because it is at fixed interest rate. In fact, this goes for our domestic debt also. Most domestic debt, not all external debt, but most domestic debt. Most domestic debt is also at fixed interest cost and not at floating interest rate. If I want to purchase a car today, I go to a bank. Bank will probably offer me a floating rate of interest. मेरे ऊपर है, मैं बैंक के साथ नेगोशिएट कर सकता हूं कि मैं बैंक से फ्लोटिंग इंटरेस्ट चाहता हूं या फिर फिक्स इंटरेस्ट रेट चाहता हूं. I will go to the bank and bank will say कि for first 2 years your interest rate is fixed at 8.5% and after 2 years we will revise according to the then prevailing interest rate. ये क्या हो गया? फ्लोटिंग इंटरेस्ट रेट हो गया है. My interest rate will change according to market conditions. Is it clear? When government has borrowed, when government has undertaken this debt, most of this debt has been taken at a fixed interest rate. As a result of that, most of this debt will be repaid on fixed interest. Therefore, it is shielded from market interest rates. If market interest rates rise, it is not going to put any additional burden upon the government. Hence, sustainable on that regard as well. So, one, most from internal sources, very small from external. Most debt from external is from institutions, वो डॉलर डिनोमिनेट होता है. अगर हम इंडिया का टोटल एक्सटर्नल डेट देखें, ये सवाल 2 बार लगातार पूछा गया इस चीज के ऊपर प्रीलिम्स में, 2020 में और 2021 में लगातार 2 साल सवाल पूछा गया है. इंडियाज एक्सटर्नल डेट इज डिनोमिनेट इन विच करेंसी? मोस्ट ऑफ इट. अराउंड 51% ऑफ इंडियाज एक्सटर्नल डेट इज इन डॉलर्स, अराउंड 29% इज इन रुपीज. ये चीज ध्यान रखना. रुपीज में भी हमारा सब्सटैंशियल पोर्शन ऑफ एक्सटर्नल डेट है. सवाल क्या पूछा गया था कि ऑल ऑफ इंडियाज एक्सटर्नल डेट इज इन डॉलर्स? नो, मोस्ट ऑफ इट इज इन डॉलर्स, बट यस, सम ऑफ इट इज इन रुपीज एज वेल एंड इन अदर करेंसीज ऑल्सो. So our external debt sustainable, our internal debt sustainable because it is incurred at a fixed cost, not at a floating cost. If you look at maturity profile, when you look at short term maturity 0 to 5 years, 2012 में around 30% of our debt was maturing in next 5 years. Today around 29% maturing in next 5 years. So maturity profile हमारी improve हो रही है, मतलब 5 साल में मैच्योर होने वाला डेट कम हुआ है. 10 साल के अंदर मैच्योर होने वाला डेट वो और भी कम हुआ है. 35% इतना था, अब 28% है. 10 से 20 साल में मैच्योर होने वाला डेट ये बड़ा है, और 20 साल से ऊपर मैच्योर होने वाला डेट ये बड़ा है. दैट मींस अवर मैच्योरिटी प्रोफाइल इज शिफ्टिंग टुवर्ड्स बीइंग लॉन्ग. More debt is now maturing in long term as compared to debt maturing in short term. On an average, our maturity profile is around 11.7 years today. Weighted maturity profile लगभग 11.7 साल की है. Therefore, we are comfortable as far as maturity profile is concerned. When we look at maturity profile, we try to make sure that this 0 to 5 year component is less than 25%. यहाँ पे कितना है? Around 29% के आसपास है. हम बोलते हैं कि जो हमारा शॉर्ट टर्म डेट है वर्सेस लॉन्ग टर्म डेट है, शॉर्ट टर्म डेट 25 से 30% ज्यादा नहीं होना चाहिए. आइडियली कम होना चाहिए, 25 से भी कम हो, लेकिन हाँ उससे ज्यादा नहीं होना चाहिए, एज इन 30 ज्यादा नहीं होना चाहिए. इट इज मोर देन 25 बट लेस देन 30, 29.3. आवर शॉर्ट टर्म डेट is around 30% of our total debt, which is fine. We would like to bring it down further to around 25%, but yes, even 29.3% is fine. Point is, we are bringing it down from 30% earlier to 29.3% now. Question in prelims: our debt maturity profile is elongating. True or false? True. बढ़ रही है ना debt maturity profile. समझ में आ गया? फॉल्स? ट्रू. ट्रू है. Our debt maturity profile is elongating, meaning that more debt is paid in longer duration, less paid in shorter duration. Has to be paid in shorter duration. So, sustainability of debt profile. Last part of sustainability is with respect to cost. Debt should be incurred at least cost, but what should this least cost be? When you go to the market to purchase something, there is some idea in your mind. You should have some idea in your mind that how much amount of money you are going to pay for something. तो कितना पैसा आपको देना है, आपके you are going to buy something. Obviously, you will want to buy it at the least price. You want to buy a television, you have an objective that I will buy this television at the least possible price. I will scan all the places where the television is being sold. आप चाहते हो मिनिमम दाम पे खरीदना, लेकिन मिनिमम का कुछ कॉन्सेप्ट भी तो होना चाहिए ना कि what is meant by this term minimum. आपके दिमाग में कुछ आइडिया भी होना चाहिए कि मिनिमम मतलब कि मैं इस प्राइस से ज्यादा पे नहीं करूंगा. देयर मस्ट बी सम बजट इन योर माइंड ऑल्सो. आप गए मार्केट में और आप 5 लाख रुपए का टीवी खरीद के ले आए, there must be some idea in your mind that this is the maximum amount of money that I'm going to pay for buying this particular good. If this good is available for a price higher than this, then I will not purchase this particular good. Government has an objective to incur debt at minimum cost. Like everybody, government also wants to borrow money at least cost. But what is the highest cost that government should be paying? Beyond that, government should not incur debt. Government ideally should not incur debt at a rate of interest which is more than the expected growth rate of the economy. If you expect economy to grow at 5%, then government should not borrow at the rate more than 5%. एक जगह है borrowing cost, एक जगह है growth rate. Interest rate, growth rate differential, IRGR, interest rate and growth rate. Growth rate of the economy, you expect that Indian economy's growth rate will be 6%. Therefore, you do not want to borrow at a price more than 6%. You go to the market with the objective of borrowing money at least cost. You would be happy if you are able to borrow at 4%, 3%, 2%. But in no case should you be borrowing at a cost more than 6%, which is the expected growth rate of the economy. Interest rate, growth rate differential. Why at a cost less than 6? That is, why at a cost less than growth rate? This is because your economy is going to grow at 6%. Meaning almost, जैसे भी हमने देखा है बायंसी 1 के आसपास है ना हमारी, बायंसी is around 1.97, पहले थी 1.13 है. Your economy grows at 5%, that means your taxes will also grow at around 5%. Your expenses will also grow at around 5%. If you have incurred a cost on your debt, जिसके ऊपर interest pay करना है, expenses का एक component है interest. If you have incurred a cost in form of interest rate on debt, and that cost is growing at a pace more than 5%, that means आपके expenses 5 से ज़्यादा grow करेंगे. आपके एक्सपेंसेस 5 से ज्यादा ग्रो नहीं कर सकते हैं, लेकिन एक्सपेंसेस का एक कंपोनेंट 5 से ज्यादा पे ग्रो कर रहा है. इसका मतलब बाकी एक्सपेंस कट डाउन करने पड़ेंगे. Therefore, when it comes to checking sustainability of debt, you see that what is the cost of borrowing that you have incurred. You look at your complete debt and then see what is the average cost of interest that I am paying on this debt. On the टोटल डेट दैट आई हैव, मेरे पास पिछले 50 साल का अक्यूमुलेटेड डेट है, उसके ऊपर आज की तारीख में मैं अगर 8% इंटरेस्ट पे कर रहा हूं और फ्यूचर में मेरी इकोनॉमी 7% ग्रो करेगी, इसका मतलब क्या है कि इंटरेस्ट एज अ प्रोपोर्शन ऑफ माय एक्सपेंसेस गोइंग टू राइज, मीनिंग अदर एक्सपेंसेस वुड हैव टू बी कट डाउन. Therefore, when I go to the market to borrow today, I try to make sure that my borrowing cost should be less than my expected growth rate. My growth rate is 7, hence I should borrow at a price not more than 7 in any case. This is interest rate growth rate differential. When you borrow money from the market, you try to make sure that the borrowing cost is less than the growth rate of the economy. For most of the time, our growth rate interest rate differential has been positive, meaning we have been able to borrow at a price less than the economy's growth rate at that particular moment. उस समय इकोनॉमी का ग्रोथ रेट जितना था और उस समय हमने क्या बोरोइंग करी, ज्यादातर समय हमने इस चीज को पॉजिटिव ही रखा है, मीनिंग वी हैव बीन एबल टू बोरो मनी, गवर्नमेंट हैज बीन एबल टू बोरो मनी एट अ प्राइस लेस देन एट विच द इकोनॉमी इज एक्सपेक्टेड टू ग्रो. तो हमारा इंटरेस्ट रेट ग्रोथ रेट डिफरेंशियल जो है जनरली पॉजिटिव ही रहा है. ड्यूरिंग कोविड इट ऑब्वियसली डिक्लाइन बिकॉज वी हैड टू बोरो अ लॉट मोर. आवर ग्रोथ रेट वाज नेगेटिव वर्सेस वी बोरोड एट सम पॉजिटिव रेट, तो इसका मतलब यहां पे तो नेगेटिव होगा. After COVID, our growth rate increased, but our borrowing costs have not increased. Therefore, this is positive. हम अब assess कर रहे हैं. This is the concluding part. We are now assessing that whether our borrowing cost will be sustainable. This brings us to our discussion of last class. Last class में हमने खत्म होते होते बात करी थी कि इंडिया का expected economic growth rate कितना है. From our high consumption, we expect the normal growth rate we expect to be around 6%. Then additional to that, we expect some gains to be realized because of infrastructure push, capital expenditure, digitization, building of trust, all these factors which are going to contribute to faster economic growth in future. So we expect that our potential in growth in future in the medium term is going to be around 6.5 to 7% के आसपास. Plus, now when we look at our debt cost is less than that. Since it is less than that, therefore we assess that our debt is sustainable. Debt sustainable क्यों है? क्योंकि हमारी expected growth rate ज्यादा है as compared to the cost of debt. Furthermore, last point, furthermore, in future we expect interest rates to go up or come down. अभी ऑलरेडी काफी हाई हो गए हैं, एक आध बार और बढ़ेंगे, उसके बाद हम एक्सपेक्ट करते हैं कम होने चाहिए. जब इंटरेस्ट रेट्स कम होंगे, दैट मींस अगेन अवर ग्रोथ रेट डिफरेंशियल विल बिकम पॉजिटिव, इवन मोर पॉजिटिव, बिकॉज अवर इकोनॉमी इज गोइंग टू ग्रो एट लेट्स से 7, बट इंटरेस्ट रेट विल कम डाउन टू अराउंड 4%, 3.5%, हेंस इवन मोर पॉजिटिव डिफरेंशियल देयर. सो देयरफॉर वी असेस दैट इंडियाज डेट प्रोफाइल इज सस्टेनेबल. सस्टेनेबल कैसे है? हमको एग्जाम के अंदर सब चीज लिखनी पड़ेगी. नंबर 1, मोस्ट फ्रॉम इंटरनल सोर्सेस. Second, most at a fixed cost and hence protected from market vulnerabilities. Third, very less from external sources and all of it from institutional sources. Therefore, they are not pressurizing us upon increasing cost because of cost in the markets are rising. Our maturity profile is elongating, meaning more debt has to be paid in longer term as compared to shorter term now. And finally, the cost of our debt is expected to continue to remain less than our growth rate. It was more than our growth rate obviously during the negative growth. यहाँ पे जब हमारी growth rate ही negative थी और interest तो आप positive cost के ऊपर bear करोगे, therefore it was negative, but it has come down to positive territory again, and the difference is also quite high. Further, we expect that the difference is going to increase, meaning our growth would be much higher and our interest cost would be much lower. Therefore, we expect that our debt to remain sustainable. This is the last part of government finances. ठीक है? With this, I have come to the end of my sessions. Now, if there are any questions, please ask. I'll answer those questions. बोलो किसको क्या क्या सवाल है? एक सवाल है ऑनलाइन. Above the line policy enhances fiscal deficit. How does the government meet the targets now? Above the line enhances fiscal deficit नहीं. Above the line fiscal deficit enhance या फिर कम नहीं कर रहा है. Above the line ट्रांसपेरेंसी बढ़ा रहा है. Below the line में आप पहले छुपा रहे थे. आप बोरो तो कर रहे थे लेकिन आप उसको दिखा नहीं रहे थे. Above the line में आप क्लियरली डिक्लेयर कर रहे हो. It increases transparency and therefore now there is a actual need of the government to meet those targets. Fiscal deficit ये बढ़ाता कम करता नहीं है, ट्रांसपेरेंसी है इसलिए ज्यादा प्रेशर है आपके ऊपर. What is the example sir explained regarding power distribution? Power distribution को कौन सा एग्जाम्पल दिया था? हाँ वो एग्जाम्पल था with respect to greater ability of states to borrow. States को टारगेट है 3% fiscal deficit का. That is, they can borrow 3% of their GDP in a particular year. But if they undertake certain reforms, such as power sector reforms, then states can borrow more than that also. So central government has cooperative federalism. There are certain, देख लो यहाँ पे exactly ये चीज है. You implement one nation, one ration policy, you are getting 0.25% extra. You improve ease of doing business reforms, you get something extra to borrow. Implement local body reforms, extra to borrow. Implement utility or power sector reforms, you get something extra to borrow. Apart from that, Finance Commission recommended enhanced borrowing limit. This is with respect to central assistance on capex. Central government is going to give you 50-year interest-free loan if you incur certain capex. तो Finance Commission recommend किया है, Central Government उसको accept किया है. तो there are additional borrowing limits for states. This is the example that I gave. और कोई सवाल किसी को पूछना है? हाँ बोलो. State sustainability. फ्रेम नहीं कर पा रहे हो क्वेश्चन. डिस्कस लिख लो सवाल. मैं फ्रेम करवा देता हूं. डिस्कस मत लिखना. अरे हम बता रहा हूं क्वेश्चन में फ्रेम कर रहा हूं. Assess the ability of states. Assess the ability of states. Assess the ability of states to improve their fiscal position, to improve their fiscal position in line with recommendations of the N.K. Singh committee. In line with recommendations of the N.K. Singh committee. ठीक है, जिनको एनके सिंह कमेटी नहीं मालूम है वो ब्रैकेट में लिख लो, वो स्लैश, जिनको मालूम है वो एनके सिंह ही लिखे रहने दो, जिनको नहीं मालूम है केवल उनके लिए बोल रहा हूँ, बाकी लोग क्वेश्चन चेंज मत करना, जिनको नहीं मालूम है वो लिख लो। क्या लिखा, क्या लिखा है हमने, स्टेट्स इन लाइन विद लिख लो, जिनको नहीं मालूम एनके सिंह वो लिख लो, in line with the target to reduce fiscal deficit to 3% and their debt to 20% of GSDP. In line with the target to reduce fiscal deficit to 3% and their debt to 20% of GSDP. ठीक है, सेंटर का पॉजिटिव में क्या था रहा है? हाँ, स्टेट्स का इतने डीपली हमने एनालाइज नहीं कर रखा। स्टेट का इकोनॉमिक सर्वे कल हिमाचल का है, देख लेना। There are certain steps given in economic survey in a box regarding measure. Listen, there एक बॉक्स दिया हुआ है इस चैप्टर में, उसमें it is written certain steps that states have taken to improve their finances. तो अलग अलग स्टेट्स ने कुछ कुछ स्टेप्स लिए हैं. Some states have implemented power sector reforms. Some states have improved their tax collection. Some states are improving the tax by taxing properties, as in property tax select कर रहे हैं. तो कुछ स्टेप्स कुछ कुछ स्टेट्स ने लिए, हम उन स्टेप्स का जिक्र कर सकते हैं. ठीक है, एक बॉक्स है वहां पे दिया हुआ है. चलो ठीक है, हाँ बोलो. तुम तो मेरे द्वारा पढ़ाए गए हो. नहीं, it is going to create confusion for others and online students, and for you, no, I'm not going to explain outside the class also. To you I have explained in the class, so therefore there is no point of explaining that thing again. और कोई सवाल नहीं? छोटे में तो वही नहीं, तब 1-1.5 क्लास लगी थी, कितना कंप्रेस कर लूंगा. और कुछ? हाँ, वीडियो देख लेना. और कुछ? When government is providing guarantee to MSME loans, then why are banks increasing provisioning? Banks are not increasing provisioning भाई. वो हमने कल जो ग्राफ देखा था, proportion of money provisioned is rising. If banks have provisioned for almost all the bad loans, that means banks are adequately capitalized. Banks provisioning तब करेंगे, as in provisioning तो हर एक लोन के केस करेंगे, but ज्यादा provisioning तब करेंगे जब कोई लोन NPA होगा. सरकार गारंटी दे रही है, उसकी वजह से कोई प्रोविजनिंग में चेंज नहीं आएगा. लोन एनपीए बनेगा, उसकी वजह से प्रोविजनिंग में चेंज आएगा. प्लस इफ बैंक्स डू नॉट हैव एडिक्वेट अमाउंट ऑफ कैपिटल, देन दे विल नॉट बी एबल टू प्रोविजन. तो बैंक्स की प्रोविजनिंग कवरेज रेशियो कम होगी. बैंक का लोन 100 रुपए का एनपीए है, बट बैंक इज एबल टू प्रोविजन ओनली 50 रुपीज अगेंस्ट दैट. इट हैज लेस प्रोविजनिंग कवरेज रेशियो वर्सेस बैंक का 100 रुपए का लोन एनपीए है और बैंक ने 70 रुपए प्रोविजन कर रखा है. दैट मीन्स प्रोविजन कवरेज रेशियो 70%, मीनिंग क्वाइट हाई. That is what was shown in that graph. It is not because government is providing guarantee, therefore there is provisioning. It is because banks are adequately capitalized and therefore healthy, hence they are able to provision. All right, जाओ का मतलब वापस आ जाना नेक्स्ट क्लास के लिए. बोलो, लास्ट सवाल है. To an extent, yes. When credit increases, so does NPAs also increase. Because NPAs increase, therefore provisioning will also have to increase. Okay? So yes, in a sense, yes, it is actually proportional there. All right, take care, bye-bye.